So the nation-state system was created at a time when the kinds of problems we have didn't exist. And we're trying to use this way of governing the planet at a time when these problems do exist and when they're overwhelming us. A second reason is, and just talk about capture here, many national governments are captured by the institutions, by interests which they're supposed to govern. So it's the special interests often are in control of the government, not the other way around. And so it's very difficult for the government to take the long-term best interests of the citizens and the nation into account. And just this nickel and dime point, if you read a lot of environmental regulations, they sound pretty good, but then when you get into them, they often, either de facto or even in the legislation, they have to give way before the growth machine, right? So you don't really get the kind of, often, not always, but often you don't get the kind of powerful tools in law that we need. Why isn't international governance working? Just a couple of these reasons. One is there's no way to assure fairness, right? So you have radical unfairness in the world, as I just described, and no systematic way to deal with it. The world government is the governmental institutions that we have, not all of them, but many of them, the UN and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, for instance, the control of those institutions is heavily weighted toward the winners of World War II. So there's much too much power vested in, particularly in the United States, in these institutions. And you also have the free rider problem, right? Well, everybody would like the climate to be stabilized, but nobody really wants to do much about it. So we propose 4 ways out of this box. One is a global reserve. Basically, the idea here is similar to the Federal Reserve or a central bank, which controls the economy through adjusting interest rates and the money supply. And our proposal is really to place underneath the whole economic system an understanding of how the planet works, right? And understanding, the basic sources of wealth on Earth, which are the natural processes which create the bounty, which makes life possible. And we suggest using the formula that I referred to earlier by Ehrlich and Holdren, the IPAC formula. Impact, I'll explain that formula just briefly. Impact is a function of population, wealth, that's the A variable, affluence, technology, and ethics or conduct or customs. They didn't have the E part of the equation. We added that. We don't think that can be multiplied. You can't multiply population times affluence in a simple way, but they are the sort of theaters in which you can act, right? There are things you can do in those 4 areas which make a difference in terms of overall impact on the Earth. So take a look at Canadian climate policy from that perspective. The steepest, or one of the steepest population growth rates in the OECD countries. Our job, according to the government's job, according to what the government says, is to get us all as rich as possible. One of our principal duties is to consume as much as possible in order to keep the whole growth job machine rolling. And all of the problems associated with climate change are going to be solved by technologies to be invented and deployed after these guys leave office. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's a total fraud. Now we propose also a trust. This idea comes from Peter Barnes. For the global commons like the atmosphere and the oceans. So if you want to use the global commons, want to fly apples from New Zealand to Quebec, right, which is done, actually literally done, then you have to pay a lot to do that. And the money that you collect could be used, presumably, to address some of the radical poverty that afflicts the world. We also propose expanding or building on the model of the European Union, where at least certain parts of sovereignty, of what the nations now claim as their sovereign functions, with regard to environment and probably to basic human rights, in my view, would be handled at a global federation level, where there would be a body that was above the nation states, would have control over certain things and would have very stiff sanctions to enforce non-compliance. And then lastly, there should be a judicial function to basically try wrongdoers, to hold nations and other players to their promises and things like that. So here are just some examples of this. This is just some pictures. The Global Federation was modeled after the European Union. This is a picture of the front of Peter Barnes' book on proposing a sky trust, basically for the United States, but we suggest globalizing this. It's the notion of the Earth's reserve, of analyzing the Earth's life support capacities, its ability to absorb, use, and dissipate energy. And then lastly, strength of the world court. So I don't think that if you look at the Canadian political system right now, there's not much leadership concerning the future well-being of the planet. I wrote to somebody in Parliament suggesting, that some things that needed to be done, and I got back a very thoughtful email from this person saying that leadership was needed, but it was going to have to come from the people. So that was a strange response, but anyway, at least it was a response. So we suggest 4 steps have to be taken to do this. One is grounding and clarification. We have to get a clear sense of what's wrong and what's needed to fix it. We need to get, as the design step is creating concepts and ideas for how to solve some of the problems I've been describing. We also need what's called in Quaker circles, but many other religions have this idea, or one very similar to it, witness, right? It is to say, that publicly, as I'm saying tonight, the situation is unsatisfactory, why it's unsatisfactory, and what needs to be done about it. And then, lastly, a nonviolent reform, right? Where if you can't get where you want to get to by persuasion, you have to create political pressure of a variety of sorts to bring about the needed changes. It is to mobilize for a kind of radical change in public policy, but not only at the nation-state level, but internationally. In approximately 1787 or so, a group of Quakers met with some Anglicans in the United Kingdom and said, basically, that slavery was not compatible with fundamental English values. That one person owning another person is a wrong thing to do. And they set about to abolish slavery in the British Empire. And the takeaway message was, this is what we, as Britons, are doing. This is what we're legitimating. Okay? And this is what we're legitimating, right? Is basically in some ways, a planet where substantial movements of refugees is now inevitable. We don't connect. Right? It was, Grace and I came on a train from Montreal to here today, and where it comes near the 401, you can see massive trucks moving, large numbers of them moving in both directions. Those trucks and those cars are drowning people